I may introduce myself. I'm Noah Alzayer. I'm a senior character TD at Insomniac Games. Yeah, I have about 6.5 years of character TD experience. Of course, I'm presenting a lot of the great work done by the rest of the technical animation team and then also the regular animation team that brought our work to life. And then it was all brought together by the entire team. This is kind of the closest we have to a team picture. I don't know, just we don't tend to take the pictures. So what exactly will I be talking about? First, I'll start with the web slinger himself, Spider-Man. Then I'll go over a lot of the work that went into making the many webs we had him sling. Then I'll talk about Otto Octavius, also known as Dr. Octopus. And then I'll finally close out with a high-level view of the faces. But first, for anyone who's unfamiliar with the game or just a little rusty on the details, here's a quick trailer.
What is happening to our city, Yuri?
I don't know. Feels like the end of the world. Maybe it is.
Peter Parker, how the hell are you?
The city is in danger. It needs our help.
All of our help.
All right, well, call the play, coach.
Gang of costume nutjobs is taking the city apart piece by piece. Time I return the favor.
This is opportunity knocking.
You know the closer you get to them, the more you become a target, right?
The closer I get, the better chance we have to stop them.
I've ordered Silver Sable and her team to shoot you on sight. This city's had enough of your vigilantism. You're officially an enemy of the people.
Come on, Peter.
How do I call you? I mean, you have like a cell phone in your pockets or something?
Thank you. So let's talk a bit about the titular character. While a few riggers did work on things in the early stages for him, a lot of the progress for the middle to the end goes to my colleague, Sergio Sykes. He was kind of our resident Spider-Man man. So pretty early into the project, the decision was made to not take the more usual route of making him a high schooler because we felt like that story had been told many times in many different mediums. Our Peter Parker was fresh out of university, learning how to be an adult and kind of balancing being Spider-Man with working in a startup for an idol of his, Dr. Otto Octavius. As such, he wasn't really built like a 16-year-old. Look-wise, we experimented with a few things, with a few different physiques. We kind of landed on sort of fit, but not like, completely muscly like Mike Tyson swinging around or anything like that. So we also wanted to make a mark by, having a specifically Insomniac suit. And with the design choices on it, we wanted it to seem very functional and sort of built with the years of experience that he had in mind. So, a lot of it was sort of based around athleisure wear in a certain way. And all the color elements within a suit kind of represented how much protection. So white was a very sort of thicker armor. Then red was a slightly padded area, and then the blue was more traditional spandex for mobility and things like that. So it's no big secret that Spider-Man as a character comes with a lot of built-in challenges. For visuals, he has a massive range of motion and a lot of iconic poses to nail. And, no spot on his body is really safe from sight. You can't really, under his armpits, under his feet, between his legs, it's all just kind of splayed out all the time. So we can't really take any shortcuts. And he has sort of a lot of large and straight design elements that have contrasting colors. So if things aren't deforming quite properly, it shows immediately. And then just to add to the pressure, he's arguably one of the most famous characters in the world. So, everyone knows what he should look like. For translating it specifically to a game, we were designing an open world that you can kind of see from any direction, so draw distances were pretty crazy. And because of that, performance was always kind of a big balancing act that we had to play with. And then, we never knew which suit the players would pick, so, they all kind of have to work. And then we'd have to figure out a way to do webs interactively in a certain way, so at odds be very adaptable. So here's some early game footage. All games have to start somewhere. Early versions of the game relied very heavily on blend shapes and kind of post-based deformers, cone readers. We used comic code readers for anyone who's familiar with them. The results were pretty good. As you can see, it was a little bit rough in the beginning. This is around probably when I joined Insomniac. It was kind of looking a bit like this. Problem was, as more work was being done and as more poses needed specific treatment, and as we iterated, lots of blend shapes turned into too many blend shapes. We started to run into caps within our game engine for the amount of blend shapes that were firing simultaneously. And then, the more blend shapes meant more rework if we needed to change the topology of the model. And then that's just larger files that are being loaded into memory, not to mention passing it down to LEDs and all that. It was kind of an unsustainable situation. We switched a lot of the heavy lifting to be done via a lot of deformation joints rather than entirely on blend shapes and things like that. It might be a little bit tough to see here, but a lot of areas for kind of rounding out the back and stuff, and the glutes were done via helper joints instead of blend shapes. But we didn't entirely abandon blend shapes by any means, because the helper joints can't quite do everything. The Maya file for it, was still in the end sizing out at over a gigabyte for the Maya binary, because we still had lots of blend shapes that were in the file. And those blend shapes, as you can see kind of here, they were used for like rounding out the back, making the buttocks less boxy, kind of getting better volume preservation in the legs and things like that. And then also keeping the design elements a little bit more consistent. Like you can most notably see it in the belt where, it was kind of stretching out when he was bent over like that. And here's the front view. As you can see, again, it's subtle but important differences that kind of give it more of a realistic feeling. But of course, the work didn't stop there. One issue with any masked character is sort of showing emotion. In the comics, they typically got around this by, kind of just drawing his eyes in a slightly different shape from panel to panel. But those are advantages that an illustrator has that we don't necessarily have in a motion-based medium or anything like that. So similar to the movies, the eyes had these sort of shutters on them, so then the animators could shape it to kind of give some feeling of, some facial expression of some sort. Then in the shader, and sometimes, dialing in via blend shapes, wrinkle maps would fire for things like bending and twisting in the chest, legs, arms, all of that. And then also there was a sort of systemic wind ripple effect that would kind of happen when things were in motion to, again, kind of hammer home the point that this is a guy in a suit rather than a suit that's stuck on his body forever. So, as is sometimes the nature of creative work, you do one thing really well, and you have to do it again and again. And again in this case meant more suits for his insane amount of spin-offs and universes. And the amount of that ended up totaling to 42 suits when we factor in all the DLC and just sort of free drops that we put out. Now, some of these suits were cloth, some were armor, and some were a little bit more tough to fully categorize. But either way, almost all the suits had those same articulating eyes, unless the design was very specific, like in the case of the Future Foundation suit or the Scarlet Spider suit. Or, there were cases where logistically it's a little impossible, like with the Bombastic Bagman or the Spirit Spider. And these suits, as you can probably see, were far from being, recycled models either. The few cases where models were recycled and it was just sort of a shader change, that usually meant it was a big shader change for things like the vintage spider suit or the negative suit. So how is this all organized and mostly done by one person? It wasn't really about any kind of insane proprietary Maya or engine tech. As with most things I've found in this industry, kind of when you peel things back, it's less about kind of insane technology and more about working smartly and executing well. So to that point, there were a lot of universal movement metrics that were established as bases for making the correctives and wrinkle maps where applicable. So then that way the animators would animate on one of the rigs and then it would just kind of work on all of them because it was kind of just a universal setup. Then there was a lot of use of this sort of proxy base in order to use wrap deformers in order to transfer and get a starting point on correctives when a new suit was done, because again, it had to be done 42 times, or 41, I guess, from the original. And other than that, the rig was the same between all of the suits. Because of that, Every suit always looked really good and fully polished in every cinematic according to the player's choice. There might be cases where it wasn't quite thematically appropriate, but that's kind of on the player at that point. However, there were a few cinematics where we did choose to lock the suit choice. First one being the Meet Peter cinematic that the game opens up with. There are issues that, it would be logistically impossible to do this sort of thing with an armor suit because he's putting it on, it just kind of makes it all very different. And frankly, this wasn't really a new game. This wasn't really an issue until we started working on the New Game Plus feature, which kind of, was one that we shipped with a patch later. So, this wasn't something we were thinking about because this is the way the game opens and you haven't unlocked suit crafting yet. But with New Game Plus, it kind of came up. And the way we kind of got around that was just opening up with the suit you open up the game with. But then when you jump out of the window, that's when it switches to the New Game Plus choice. It was a team favorite. So then also for the final sequence, we lock the suits. Partly because story-wise, he's supposed to be wearing a specific kind of armor to defeat Otto. Spoiler alert. But then he also gets his mask damaged, so we had to do that version of that suit for that. Then he gets stabbed in the shoulder, and then finally takes off his mask so he can see his aunt for the last time. Hope you guys played the game. All right. So logistically and story-wise, it just kind of made sense to make sure that we wouldn't have a spirit spider, ruining the mood because, how is he going to pull off the mask? It's a skull, and all that. So yeah, that's a lot of the work that was done by, again, my coworker Sergio on Spider-Man. So now that we've talked about the man, let's talk about how he gets around and fights crimes, his webs. So many character TDs were involved in these sort of things, and then also as a very cross-departmental effort as well. So let's start with the sort of procedural webs. This is done with a lot of help from our gameplay engineers. Basically, what we did on the rigging side was the Spider-Man rig just had web start and end joints in the rig, and then just to kind of help out animators, we just had this kind of spline in there to kind of show what was going on. Then when it was exported into the engine, a curve would spawn between those joints via an animation event that would draw a sort of spline between those points and then throw in a sort of sine wave noise along it to kind of give the feeling of, rope or whatever, or, in this case, webs. And then a texture was instanced along that curve to create a web effect. So here it is once it was actually gotten to the engine. As you can see, there aren't really any joints. It's just the beginning and end joint, and it's kind of procedurally done between the two. Then, the webs had to attach to buildings. That was very much a sort of massive fan request rather than just shooting into the sky. And then, the same sort of system was used for that as well. So, tons of animations were created to feed into the traversal system by the animators. And then, that sort of web end joint would procedurally attach to the nearby buildings. But for more specific needs, we used a few just Maya rigs, but the one that was mostly used was the cinematic web. As you can see, it has sort of these broad strokes controllers and then a lot of tweak controllers. It was a ribbon spine based controller. For anyone who's unfamiliar with that, it's when you take a NURBS plane and constrain joints along the surface, usually using a UV based sort of node. So yeah, it had those, and then there's sort of a slide attribute for telescoping along the sort of resulting curve, so then you could kind of get that feeling of shooting out. And then there were scalable and shapeable attachment cones at the beginning and end of the sort of web. So then it was mostly just used for the end one, but then they could attach the other end to something else and kind of give it the feeling of pulling out. Then there were lots of nonlinear deformers for procedural shaping. Like you can see, there were two sine waves here, some twist things, lots of things to just kind of help the animators kind of get quick and pleasing shapes on them. Now, the web blanket rig was a bit of a concert between gameplay engineering and our effects department. And what it basically was a big matrix of joints that was bound to a web blanket model. And then it would just kind of attach to nearby collision for the environment or the character you can see here that's been webbed up to kind of give the feeling of him actually being cocooned in a way that's adaptable for every situation. Finally, there were tons of specific webs, like web cocoons for all the different body types, face webs for perfect dodges, and then we use those in a few cinematics as well. And then a lot of very specific ones for specific cases in cinematics. All told, we probably had like 20 different web rigs just for all that sort of stuff. But these are, a few of the bigger ones that I thought were pretty cool. That wraps webs. Let's talk about Doc Octopus. Again, probably at this point, we actually kind of kept it a little bit quiet that he was in the game while marketing, but then, that was the last little surprise that we were trying to save for when it came out. So I would like to say that along with the consumer, Doc Ock actually turned out to be a little bit of a final boss of sorts for the actual development team as well, because a lot of his challenges were very large and intensive, and a lot of his visual design and then his fight design came in towards the end of production as well. So it was kind of an all hands effort a little bit. But I'll note that as with the Spider-Man rig, for the tentacles and most of the rest of the rig, I'm presenting a lot of the work of my colleague Sophie Brennan. Luckily, as a studio, we aren't entirely unacclimated to the idea of tentacles because in our back catalog, we've worked on a lot of things that just involve a lot of aliens and stuff. With the tentacle rigs for him, it used a lot of similar principles to the cinematic web rig that you saw before. But in this case, it was like the web rig, but on steroids. Partly, this was, no point in reinventing the wheel, just because this was all kind of tight deadlines and all that. But then also, animators are familiar with it, so they could kind of hit the ground running with it as well. So, model was still being done on the model and rig when animation needed to get started. So, it was kind of built in a lot of ways where they were similar to the web rig, about a lot of layers of control and multiple levels of a sort of ribbon spine based thing, where there were where it all kind of then just came out to the export joints that would go out to the engine. So the animators would shape one ribbon with the shape controls that had the joints constrained, would drive more tweak controls, and kind of just finally get out. Then in Doc Ock's case, though, stretching kind of presented a unique challenge, because usually we'd use these tentacles for things like, in the case of the webs, it's something that's allowed to be stretchy because it's a spider web kind of thing. But these inorganic forms that we were dealing with Doc Ock, we didn't want them to stretch because they were made out of metal and hard rubber and things like that. So it was actually set up to have a massive possible length that would then telescope with fixed segments. So then the animators, as they stretch it out, they would just kind of collapse into his back. And this sort of behavior was able to be turned on or off via an attribute in the rig, because this was generally meant to be something that was just used in the cinematics. So, the animators would see the image to the left, where it's all kind of collapsed inside, but the way it was actually bound to the skeleton was the way you see it on the right, where that was basically the maximum possible length for that sort of telescoping behavior. And speed was always an issue in Maya because each of these tentacle rigs was pretty complicated and required a lot of calculation, geometry, all of that. And then there were 4 of them, so just, even one would sometimes slow down Maya a little bit. So whereas we only tend to create one proxy based on a mesh for kind of getting animators to be able to animate quickly and in real time, this one actually had multiple levels to try and let the animators hide a lot of certain elements of the thing and really simplify the geometry a lot, so then they could try and get some real-time playback within Maya. So rounding out the character were a few other challenges. One was his sort of fashion choices. As you can see, he wears this damn turtleneck that was, it was a thing where, kind of, we started out with it just kind of bound to the neck, but it just didn't look like a turtleneck in that point. So we added controls that the animators could just kind of offset, but the results weren't that great, and the animators hated it because who would enjoy doing that? So what we ended up doing was kind of setting up a bunch of, what I did was I went into the head rig and brought in a bunch of locators that used a closest point on poly node. For anyone who's unfamiliar with that, you can just feed in a point and then an input mesh, and it'll tell you the closest point to the surface on that. So because of that, we could get some sort of sliding behavior along it as he kind of moved and talked and opened his mouth and things like that. The goggles themselves used point on poly, which is, for anyone who doesn't know that one, it's a UV-based constraint where you can just kind of stick it to a certain point on the geometry. So I stuck locators at the top and bottom of the sort of orbital sockets, so when he'd raise his eyebrows and things like that, they'd move that tiny little bit. And then for the actual goggle contacts, the sort of rubber area, I used a bunch of other closest point on poly to, again, kind of get it to slide along the surface as things sort of moved around. As you can see, there was occasionally some skipping, though, and that's kind of due to the omnidirectional nature of closest point on poly. So sometimes, the closest point will be like inside the eye or something like that. So I've actually since written a Maya node to kind of do just a specific raycast direction, but that wasn't necessarily done in time for this. But for anyone who kind of starts down this road, that might be something you'd consider doing if you have the ability to do so. So, as if one turtleneck wasn't challenging enough, we added another high collar for the Doc Ock suit. So, the thing is, though, we didn't really want it to behave like the turtleneck because it had this sort of opening in the front, kind of like a half zip or something. So, just making contact wouldn't be enough because if it leaned to the side, we didn't want the other side to actually necessarily follow. So, what we ended up doing was using keep out nodes, which are Maya muscle nodes, where you can kind of feed in a collider and it'll stay in position unless it's pushed out by that collider. Then the animators had shaping controls on top of that where they could kind of push it back or push it out if it either moved too far or didn't move far enough. But as with most ideas, it wasn't necessarily thought up by us, but it was actually thought up by a smart person before me, and she shared it with the world. So it's kind of a cool thing about the sharing nature of this industry. So as we were sort of trying to think of ways to polish up this character a little bit for that aspect, I kind of came across this tutorial that she had written, and it was very helpful. So I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of keep out nodes, but for anyone who's unfamiliar, you could check out our website here. And that's kind of where the tutorial is. One thing I sort of set up differently from the tutorial, where keep out nodes tend to just kind of push out in a specific direction, what I ended up doing was have that translate of the push out drive moving into a pose, because I actually wanted it to curl down rather than just pushing out, to kind of give the appearance of like again, more rigid like leather or something like that. So going in, there was a very high bar that we kind of had to clear because, lots of characters in a very populated city, first of all. And then the characters are a very important aspect to Spider-Man stories, both when he's in the costume and when he's out of the costume. A lot of characters are very heavily featured. So frankly, with the results we wanted, we knew we'd need some help. So for that help, we worked with 3 Lateral. For anyone who's unfamiliar with them, they're based out of Serbia. They're a company who does a lot of data acquisition and facial rig creation. And, a lot of good-looking games in the past have, featured their work. So the rigs they made for us use photogrammetry, which is a 3D scanning tech that involves a lot of, just a big array of cameras in this sort of Death Star-looking thing that you have people sit in. And they were based on FACS. Now, what's FACS? It stands for Facial Action Coding System. And it's a system that was popularized about 30 years ago by a man named Paul Ekman. And it essentially breaks down the anatomically possible movements in the face. It was originally developed as a psychology tool, but with this breakdown, since we're all experts, you can tell I was having a rough day. But yeah, it tends to lend itself well to making realistic facial rigs and performance capture, and thus is often the basis of control systems and deformation for realistic rigs. The terminology can kind of switch around a little bit depending on who you're working with and stuff, but that's the general thrust of it. Why work with them rather than doing it just all internally? Frankly, they knew their stuff. We had a production cycle of about 3.5 years, and they just kind of had a proven track record and a system in place. So with all these characters we needed, we worked out multiple tiers for quality when setting up these work agreements with 3 Lateral. The way things worked out, all the characters were divided into 5 tiers that I'll go through. Tiers 1 through 3 were any sort of named characters, is kind of what we referred to it sometimes. They covered any cinematics who had characters who had more than a couple lines in any sort of Golden Path cinematic. And this was at time of casting. As you guys might know, games take a long time to make, rewrites happen. There are some characters that were sort of written out of the story for, purposes of things being a little bit too crowded. So we had these characters that we'd cast for them. We had to kind of repurpose them, but we found ways to just kind of use them in cinematics where we might have normally just used a lower tiered character. There was actually one character who's in the slideshow. There's this one rig that we used for 3 separate characters, thanks to some sort of hairstyling and kind of texturing wizardry from our character art team. And no one seemed to notice, so that's pretty cool. So these rigs were based off of scans of the actors doing the facial poses in the sort of fax shapes that I was mentioning before. And the classification of tiers 1 through 3 kind of just determined how much kind of how tough we were basically about kind of matching them to the scans and things like that. So tier 1 characters like Peter or MJ or some of those guys we'd go through really with a fine-tooth comb. Then the tier 3 characters, as long as it didn't necessarily look broken, it wasn't as important to like really get like that stuff, because they were sometimes only in cinematics for along with the pure deformation that was kind of brought up. These rigs also had blending, normal, and diffuse maps to kind of simulate wrinkles and skin flushing. And these were extracted from those photogrammetry scans that I had mentioned before. So to that end, they delivered each rig with 3 wrinkle and color maps respectively that were masked to create a total of 37 tracks that would blend in during animation to replace the normal and color result. So for tier 4 characters and below, we made them for kind of just other side characters as needed, the sort of minor characters and background people. These were based off of single scans of studio employees or relatives of the studio employees. So, if you know some people at Insomniac and saw some familiar faces in the game, it might have been them. But these scans were only in the neutral pose because that's the only way we'd capture them. So the movements weren't necessarily based off of scans, but more based off of statistical estimation, driven by a model that 3Lateral had developed. Then instead of the 37 respective color and wrinkle maps with the higher tiers, the tier 4 rigs had 24 blending wrinkle map tracks and no color tracks. And then since there weren't any scans of them, that rig logic was in place in the rigs, but we didn't necessarily have the wrinkle maps delivered. So what we did was we changed our shader to, instead of replacing the normal result, we had some shared wrinkle maps that would come in additively, so then they could be shared between the characters. So we made sets for male, female, and then just an elderly one, and just we would apply those wrinkle map tracks to those characters. Finally, for tier 5, we fed in a bunch of the heads that had already been created for our game as seeds for a sort of character creator, along with like sliders and everything, kind of, like Oblivion style or Skyrim. I guess it's a little dated. One of our character artists created a wide variety of faces for things like thugs, police officers, just random civilians that might be in cinematics and stuff. And then we sent those values back to 3Lateral, and they created rigged versions that they sent back to us. And all told, we got 90 of them. So it was definitely a case where having a simple command that would do the sort of processing to get them engine ready helped out a lot. Then functionally, for our purposes on our ends, these heads were very similar to the tier 4 heads. So, they had the same mesh topology and shader setup and all that. So it's pretty much the same process as processing those tier 4 rigs, but done on way more characters. So for our feedback loop with the tiers 1 through 3 characters, when they delivered those rigs, they would also send a spreadsheet of rig controller values to match the fax scans that had been captured, along with the fax scans themselves. So I wrote a function to read those controller values from the spreadsheet and create a sort of calisthenics animation, as well as import the scans to match those timings. So with that, we could get a play blast out of Maya of the characters kind of going through these poses, then another play blast of the scans themselves, and then usually what we'd do is export it to the game engine as well and get a capture of that. Then they'd be brought into a template Premiere project to get a sort of a video where we could compare the rig behaving in Maya against the scans and against the way it went out to the engine. So we could kind of go in and create a comparison between the scans and the rig to kind of get a ground truth comparison. And then we could see what it looked like in Maya versus the engine, so we could kind of suss out any internal issues we might have with the way the thing exported out to the engine. And with the help of sort of the tool and the workflow we'd set up with the template Premiere project and all that, kind of that process was able to be farmed out to a junior employee from our production services department, where they could just kind of get those videos out to us within an hour. So then the art director and I could go through and do drawovers and send them back to 3Lateral. And we did a lot of this feedback through email because they're based out of Serbia. We're based out of Los Angeles, so the time difference is a little crazy. Not as crazy as here, but from that, what I can say, at least speaking from our perspective, this made for a great working relationship where more often than not, we were kind of on the same page. There weren't like a lot of miscommunications or anything like that. And, that's definitely saying something, considering miscommunications can happen with someone who's 10 feet away versus, thousands of miles. So even though they were doing very good work on the face, neck movement was like kind of just for Adam's apple and neck flexing and things like that in service of the facial performance. Basically, they were tasked with getting the facial movements, but sort of body mechanics and things like that weren't under the purview in the work agreement and all that. So, it wasn't necessarily something we were thinking about until we actually started getting facial animation in the game and all that. And, the neck especially kind of looked pretty rough compared to the high level of the faces. So it was clear we had to get the rest up to the level with the face. So luckily we had the opportunity and time to push things a little bit further, since we already had a few hundred corrective blend shapes coming in, adding a few for like head looks and things like that. Would just kind of be a drop in the bucket. So we just kind of, I would just go through and author these blend shapes for getting that sort of sternomastoid flex as the head turned and kind of give the whole thing a little bit more of a grounded look. So when they delivered the heads to us, they all just kind of had the standard eyelashes, eyebrows, eyeball geometry, and all that. But in order to hit the look we needed for our direction, our team would sometimes go in and create new meshes for things, what I called facial accessories. So just like, eyebrows and things like that. But then also sometimes hair. Hair was typically on the body, but sometimes we'd have it in the head rig file. And then also, things like jewelry and all that. Thing is, 3-lateral wasn't on our version control system. So, when they deliver new versions of the rig to us, it was just kind of based off of their working environment in these sort of fresh files. Now, getting those meshes kind of out of our working version and back into the new one would be, a big thing where you'd have to constantly be re-exporting things. You'd waste a lot of time and potentially things would be forgotten between the versions. So to get around this, I added a function to our processing tool to sort of save out these extra meshes and associated data to a character post folder. The way it worked it would simply duplicate those meshes into a matching hierarchy within the scene and then export it. And then it would also send out the exported skin weight data files to that same folder as well. So then when we got a new version of the rig that was kind of a clean version from 3-lateral, importing those extra meshes skinned in their proper respective like LOD groups and things like that into that fresh file was a simple button click with little or no thought required. Also saving out those corrective blend shapes that I was referring to before, it would all kind of go out to that same folder. So since the pipeline had already been written to export shapes out to a folder and store them and bring them back in, we were actually occasionally were able to find some other cool uses. One notable one was Kingpin. I wanted to have like a little bit of a jiggle, but problem was a lot of the joints in this area were already being taken up for facial joints and things like that, so I couldn't necessarily just throw in a joint for that area. So what we did was I modeled a sort of direction vector in X, Y, and Z in the positive, and then it was driven by a sort of Maya muscle movement, and it would go in the positive and negative to kind of create this effect that would just kind of stack on top of any facial movement. As you can see, it's a little exaggerated here just to kind of make the point. But yeah, then we just go in and sort of bake those in Maya and then export it out to the engine. You can kind of see it's a very small but subtle difference. And I don't know, people maybe might not have noticed it, but it at least made me happy. So that covers cinematics, but for gameplay, those heads were way too heavy for our open world civilians because we wanted to make a sort of realistic feeling in New York that wasn't necessarily a ghost town. So it became clear pretty quickly with the amount that we wanted, we'd need to be very economical with our computing resources. So luckily, our engine has a sort of vanity mesh system where you can have toggleable sub-meshes for things within the model that we just call our sort of look system. So we had already had all the possible shirts, pants, gloves, and shoes in these sort of civilian master files. So what we ended up doing was adding those head models to be in the body model as looks as well. Problem was, before when the original plan was to have a separate files for each head, so then they could actually have bespoke positions for things like eyes and stuff, and then it would just kind of work within our engine retargeting. Now that they were all in this shared file, that kind of presented a problem because, the faces kind of had certain facial landmarks in slightly different spots. So then at that point, what we would have had to do would be to either have specific joints for each single head or kind of conform all the faces to each other to have the same sort of eye position, mouth position, that sort of thing. Thankfully, there wasn't much consideration for that. What we elected to do instead was create just an 11-joint facial rig that only used translate instead of any rotation to move the brows and lips and even the eye blink, which worked surprisingly well. So the way we handled different sizes of faces, or more importantly, the eyelids, was I would just go in and like kind of for smaller eyes, I'd skin the weight influence for the eyelid joints was just lower. So then there was just one animation that would kind of work between all these characters, as you can see here. So yeah, the only joint that actually used rotation was the jaw, and that just didn't seem to present that many problems because the jaw wasn't typically that crazy different. It was mostly the eyelids that would have presented the problem. So that that kind of covers faces for as much time as I have for the talk as well. Of course, with this and other subjects, I could probably talk for like 6 hours, and a lot of detail had to be glossed over. So if anyone has GDC Vault access, I'd recommend read it, maybe looking up the PDFs as well. I think those are freely available. But my colleague Sophie did a talk on Doc Ock, and then also she did one on the cloth and hair, which I kind of just had to completely cut out. And then I did a full hour talk on the faces as well. Anyways, that's about all I have time for. I'd like to thank the rest of the Tech Anim team, and then also just shader team, animation team, engineering team, character team, all that. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me out. Thank you.